So here we are, everyone. Boy, and let's go live. We are live. Hey, everyone. Hi. I know, it's we're getting used to the fact that as soon as you punch live, we are live. And I just gonna get my screen all set here. Hi, everyone. Emil Guillermo, Emil Amok to you here at we call this Sunday brunch at the FANHS Museum, the Filipino American National Historical Society Museum. Of course, we're not at the FANHS Museum because we can't because of COVID. And that's why it's really Sunday brunch with Filipino American history in Emil Guillermo's closet is gongs, double gongs, Benny Agbayani, jersey. Official signed Mets. It's good to be here with you. We've been doing this now for a few months now since we realized that it was foolish to say, well, the museum is going to be open again and we're going to see you all. No, the museum is not going to be open again for a while, and we aren't going to see you all. I mean, and that's the irony of it, right? I mean, it would be great if we could open up the museum. Museums in Stockton were open Saturday and Sunday, the only 2 days. And we were waiting since March to say, okay, it's going to get better. It's going to get better. And it hasn't gotten better. And that is to our eternal disappointment because the museum is like a 2,000 square foot space that's been open for 5 years and we haven't been able to do our thing for since March 30th. So almost 9 months. I mean, the thing about what we're doing here now is that we've discovered to go virtual, and we do this virtually because we can share Filipino American history with you. And really, is there anything better we can do on a Sunday morning except share Filipino American history? I mean, you're saying Sunday brunch with a meal. What's on the menu? Filipino American history. What else? We'll serve up a lot of Filipino American history. And we're talking about current and past because as we live it, as soon as it's gone, they say the news is the first draft of history. As we live it, as we report it, as we say it, it's gone. We're on to the next thing. Now it's history. The newspaper isn't fish wrap or birdcage decor. It's history. And so as a journalist in both the mainstream and Filipino and ethnic press, Asian American ethnic press, I thought, yeah, let's do this. We'll just go on live. We'll talk about the things that happened. And of course, views expressed are my own and of our guest. And if you have tuned in, we have a lot of lively guests. Yesterday, one of our liveliest or one of our youngest, certainly, Isabel David, who is the vice president of the FANHS chapter in Los Angeles. As I mentioned, yet not the junior chapter of FANHS, the big FANHS. She's all of 20. We need people like her. And if you're someone like her, Filipino American, born here or immigrated here young, is now a Filipino American, is trying to find out about what the history is about, because you don't get it in school, contact us here at the museum, put it in the chat box or email me at emilamok@gmail.com, emilamok@gmail.com. And, we'll talk about your story. We'll help you get involved with the museum. Isabel, go onto our Facebook Live library on FANHS, FANHS Museum. And you can see her interview talking about stuff happening in LA, stuff happening to youth. Incredible. Like I say, there's Filipino American history happening all around us. But I look at the news. I look at the mainstream news, all the news, the ethnic news. We'll get into that a little later. But I'll look at the mainstream news, New York Times, LA Times, San Francisco Chronicle. I'll read the news and I'll try to find missing Filipino parts, because usually there are. But in a general sense, we're all kind of included in there. Big story in the New York Times about Los Angeles. And it's too bad I just saw it today. It wasn't on yesterday. I would have asked Isabel about this. She lives in a suburb of LA, one of the big Filipino enclaves like Carson, Cerritos, Long Beach. I mean, they're all big enclaves around LA. But here they're talking about, in this LA Times piece, they're talking about an area near, in between Koreatown and the Pico Union area. And just to the northeast of that is the historic Filipino district. They call it the historic Filipino town. And they're talking about how COVID has impacted multi-generational families. That's kind of our story today. They didn't mention Filipinos. They mentioned the neighborhoods, Pico, Union, and Koreatown in between that. And in that area, they're talking about households of immigrants, immigrant-oriented families, multi-generational. We fit that bill. Now, some of those multi-generational families have since moved out of Filipino town, historic Filipino town, and some of those areas have been gentrified. Another story, another historical story of our times. But as I read the story, which did not mention Filipinos, but only the fact that immigrants who have a husband or wife who is working in some of the most dangerous, right, frontline positions, with a grandmother, right, her mother's there, and the worker's daughter's there. So you have three generations all in one cramped housing unit, sometimes an apartment, sometimes a small house. And they compared the death rates of this area with the death rates in white neighborhoods in LA. And it's like, doesn't even compare. It's like white area, white neighborhood, 10 deaths, 21 deaths, 30 deaths. This area here in this, where Filipinos and other immigrants live in multi-generational households, 100 deaths, 200 deaths, 300 deaths. I mean, it shows the inequality that we're living under now due to COVID. COVID has exposed all the inequalities. And if you want to look at an historical situation, just look at the news. I mean, we have been, for some of us, we've been all kind of Trump-licated. And then we had the inaugural this past week. Listen to my interview with Dan Gonzalez, Professor Dan Gonzalez. We talk about the inaugural and what it means. But we've been so, how shall we say, so preoccupied with, this moment. And then, of course, January 6th happened. So we are all in this high anxiety way, because we knew what was going to happen on January 20th. And the intelligence said all throughout the country and all the capitals. We did have skirmishes and all throughout the capitals, but throughout the country, but nothing like January 6th. Thank goodness. Normalcy, right? The ship is now upright. Democracy moves forward. And unfortunately, what that means is that we pay attention now to the thing that we should always have been paying attention to for the last year, and that is the coronavirus. Last year at this time, January, I was planning a trip to LA, and I stayed in a hotel in Chinatown, LA. That's how I got to know the Pico Union and the Koreatown and the historic Filipino town, because my guide, the great LA activist, Noel, he showed me what's going on down there. I was sensing we hadn't been locked down yet. We were talking about everyone was talking about the virus, but no one was doing anything. We were still at the level of Trump saying, well, it'll be gone. And he said this. He said, I don't really want to do any testing because we don't want to know how bad it is. That was a year ago, right? Now, 400,000 deaths and rising, 500,000 by February, they say. We got 25 million cases. And when the feds don't get involved immediately, set the standard. I'll look at the patchwork quilt kind of approach. We don't have a uniform approach. And so we have things like in San Francisco, they are locked down, but they have more ICU beds available than Sacramento, which isn't locked down and has fewer ICU beds. In San Joaquin County, this is all just in California. In San Joaquin County, I believe our ICU beds are still we're still less than zero, I believe. We're locked down, hence the museum's locked down. But all these disparate policies and approaches, and we're a mess. 400,000 deaths. So all of this explosion came after reading the news. That just the news about Pico and the multi-generational houses or housing and the rise in deaths there out of proportion. Last week we talked about the Filipino nurses, a fraction of the nursing population, but the largest, a third of the deaths, frontline nurses, Filipinos dying. So this is the inequality that that the coronavirus has exposed all throughout society and everything we do. And you read the news and you see, wow, I don't have the Filipino parts. I can't necessarily confirm it because it's not in the story, but that families that they're talking about have to be a large number, a significant number. Let's just say a significant number, a number large enough to care about are Filipinos. So I say all this because last night I just could not sleep very well. Maybe it was something I ate, but it usually means that you can't lie down on your back, on your organs to sleep well because there's something going on and it's painful. I've had gallstones in the past. This was not like a gallbladder attack, but it was related to some kind of eating thing. Maybe too much hot sauce, perhaps, hence the red today. I don't know. But I was tossing and turning, and then I was on my belly, and I was thinking of another coronavirus story that I was reading about people intubating, people finding comfort in the hospital with their sleeping on their stomachs. And then, it was like 3:00 in the morning, which is 4:00 in the morning. It was like 7:00 in the coast. And I got an alert about a friend of mine who is intubated, is in an induced sleep, and they're going to have a prayer vigil for him. So that's what I'm going to do today. Doesn't mean, you can pull yourself out of that, but if you're in the healthcare profession, if I say intubations, induced sleep, and if you've got some other kind of symptoms going, the reports are in LA, they're rationing care. My friends on the East Coast, I don't think they're rationing care there, but we're going to cut this a little short because I'm going to go try to do a prayer circle to help my friend. We have friends who are out there. I've had friends who've died under COVID because the hospital situation is always stacked up against you. If you have something else and everyone else has COVID and all the attention's on COVID, you're affected. But I haven't had people I know who were directly impacted by COVID in this way. And it combined with the idea that there I was trying to simulate how an intubated person would sleep by sleeping on his stomach last night. It just made me think about what a crazy, crazy, crazy time we're in, which is why I always I ask Isabel, how are people dealing with this? Rick, note down how you take a picture, write a note to yourself, put it in your COVID diary. It will be history when we look back at this 2 years, 3 years, 5 years from now, and we remember what happened. Because we'll be talking about this for a long time, about how it happened, how it spread, our response. It will be part of the Filipino American sense of what happened under COVID. Now, I want to get to one thing. I talk about the Philippine news, Philippine ethnic newspapers, and people say, okay, Emil, you can talk about this, but what does this have to do with Filipino American history? Aren't you a Filipino American historical society? Yeah, it has a lot to do. Look, January 22nd, we talk about January 22nd, 1930 in my previous interviews with, talked about it with Isabel, talked about it with some other people. For January 22nd, 1930 is when Fermin Tobera was shot and killed, shot in the heart after dancing with white women in Watsonville. Part of that 5-day Watsonville riot, a white mob went after Tobera, shot down the bunkhouse where he was in. He was an ag worker. Shot down the bunkhouse, Tobera died. And he, of all the riots that took place in America, anti-Filipino riots in the 20s and 30s, we remember Fermin Tobera. His body made a big deal about it, as they should. They sent his body back to the Philippines. It was a marker, his death. 22-year-old Filipino guy. Nothing special necessarily, just one of us, an American national, who, for the immediate cause, people were angry that he was dancing with white taxi dancers, the white dance hall girls. So we mentioned that bit of history, January 22nd, 1930. But oddly enough, on January 22nd, another thing happened in Filipino American history. The first Filipino American newspaper, the Philippine Independent News, begins publication in Salinas, 1927. The Philippine Independent. I'd never heard of that. And one of the courses I taught in journalism at San Francisco State, when I taught there a couple semesters, one particular course about essentially the history of the ethnic news, or it's really the history of news, but you just don't say, hey, here's the New York Times. It was no, it was not the first. The first newspaper in America was actually in the 17th century, 1600s. And it was, of course, the first white mainstream newspaper, which usually talked about how the white concerns were being disrupted by slaves or by Native Americans, and typical white newspaper, right? Public occurrences, it was called. But, the Filipinos, the fact that you have a newspaper means you have a society, you have a community, you have a thing worth talking, a thing worth addressing, and things happen to this thing. Things happen to people, the Filipino people, and they need to know what's going on. And that's why these Filipino newspapers came about. And our dear friend, I go to Don's book a lot, because Don's book really pretty much tells us about the importance of the Philippine American press, the Philippine news. I mean, she writes about it. Let me pull this up on the screen. It's always good to talk about Don Boholano Mabalan, our friend, when we can. And this is, okay, I'm sharing my screen. This is the book, Little Manila's in the Heart. Go here to, they talk about 1931 editorial editions of the Stockton-based Filipino-American newspaper, 3 stars. 3 stars in Stockton. Admonish the readers for sending exaggerated stories of success back to their families and friends in the Philippines. Now, this was the headline news of the day, right? This is in 1931. Don mentions this because Philippine papers notorious for their editorials, right? Their opinions, their columnists, which is why one of the things I wanted to do in journalism was be a columnist for the ethnic press, mainstream too. I was a columnist for some mainstream newspapers as well. But here it was, the Filipino American newspaper, 3 stars, admonish their readers for sending exaggerated stories of success back to their families and friends in the Philippines. Quote, every paisano ought to tell the truth, nothing but the truth, to friends over in the Philippines, wrote D.L. Marquelo. Each of us must not write of boastful descriptions of fictitious properties we have come into. What we should do is unravel the tragic sufferings that one might encounter in America. Wow. The truth, right? And because no one was telling this truth in the context of a newspaper, I mean, certainly you wouldn't find it in the San Francisco Chronicle or the Stockton Record because they wouldn't get that in Manila. So people were, and they wouldn't read that in the Filipino community. So Marquelo is saying, hey, you guys writing letters back to your people back in the Philippines, tell the truth. Put in the letter that, hey, it's not so great here. Filipinos are getting killed. Filipinos are being discriminated against. We can't marry. I got to hang around with 10 of my paisanos, as Marquelo called, 10 of my buddies. They didn't call them monks. I didn't think that, well, unless, Manang Bill, Manang Jimmy, Manang, but they weren't like, as a whole, the Manong generation. That was something later that some, observer put on them. But here were these men who were like wandering around saying, oh, I need to dance. I need to dance with taxi. This is the situation. We needed Filipino-American press. We needed the balitang to get the truth. And Marquelo was one of those who said, this is the truth. That's why the Filipino-American press. I mean, Don used it as source material for her books. I always like to say, I always love to say that the news, journalism, first draft of history. And I'm proud to say that Don used a couple of my articles in her book. Happy to be a footnote in a book like Don Boholano Mabalan's book, Little Manila is in the Heart. We keep mentioning it because it's kind of like not a text, but more like a Bible, right? It's more like, hey, this is it. This will tell you the story about Filipino Americans in one area in Stockton and compare it to where you came from and see how it matches up. And it's funny, it's like a mirror, which is often what they call a newspaper, a daily mirror of life. How funny, how very little do you often see yourself, right, in that mirror. Filipino Americans, they don't cover us. They don't cover us, which is why we have Filipino ethnic media and we mentioned this, the first Filipino American newspaper, the Philippine Independent News in Salinas, January 22nd, 1921. 1921. Filipino American history. Now, how does that compare with where we are today? Let me turn to uh, this guy, Michael Cabana. Michael. Michael's an old friend of mine from San Francisco. When I worked in newspaper, I worked in television in San Francisco. Michael was joined the Chronicle. He's still a general assignment breaking news reporter. I say still because he's had these up and down. Well, he's had more meaty roles as he was the tech reporter. That was his beat. Everything tech he covered. He's a great reporter, and he's also a union guy there, or was, and he still is. But I honor Michael as a Filipino American in the news media, a fellow Filipino American journalist. We get there. There's a handful of us. I was the first Filipino to host a national news show when I hosted at NPR's All Things Considered in Washington, D.C., 1989. Happy to have broken that barrier. A small one. Look, it's not a big barrier, but I was the first. No one makes a big deal of it, but I do because I'm a Filipino American and I don't see any others before me at the time. Not there. The other Filipinos who worked at NPR, one guy in particular, he was working on the desk as a writer. He knew how important it was. Max. So I mentioned Michael because Michael wrote a really great story. Let me get rid of all this stuff here. And I just want to share it with you because it goes back to the idea of what's going on, Emil. What's going on with COVID? New study ranks the riskiest jobs in California during the pandemic. Look at those guys. I mean, they could be Filipino, but they're all people of color. And as the state struggles to vaccinate by Michael and Jill Tucker. As the state struggles to vaccinate people against the coronavirus, a new UCSF study shows essential workers, especially in food and transportation industries, bear the greatest risk of death among Californians of working age. The authors suggest the employees be moved up in line for shots. That's the other thing. Who's getting vaccine? We don't even know. I suddenly qualified in the first tier. It could be 4 months before I get my shot in California. And by then, a new mutation will come in, making the shot not totally irrelevant, but less relevant than it would have been if I got it right now. So here are the jobs: cooks, packaging machine operators, ag workers, construction laborers are among the riskiest jobs. Other occupations with high-risk death include sewing machine operators, shipping, receiving clerks, maintenance workers, customer service workers, truck drivers, maids, and house cleaners. While we pay a lot of lip service, this is a quote, to essential workers, when you see the actual occupations that rise to the top of the list as being as much more risk and associated with death, it screams out at you who's really at risk, said Kirsten Bibbins Domingo, a UCSF epidemiology and biostatistics professor who worked on the study. In other words, yeah, it's nurses, yeah, it's doctors, but generally doctors and nurses make a little more money, so you see a class thing there. By virtue of their job, they're exposed. But look at this. By virtue of what they have to do to earn a living, cooks, packing machine operators, truck drivers, maids, house cleaners, maintenance workers, customer service workers, they're the front lines. And that's That shows you how broad this is. Not just the nurses, not just the doctors, the people on the, I doubt if a maintenance man makes as much as a doctor or even a nurse, or certainly a maid doesn't make as much as a nurse. But look at how they all are doing these jobs that expose them. They need to get vaccinated. That's the upshot of this. The occupational data came from death certificates and was grouped into 9 general categories. Let's see. Working adults in the 18 to 65 range experienced a 22% increase in deaths during the pandemic. Agriculture workers had a 39% increase. Those are the highest. Uh, so, there's a picture. Someone, they're not white. John Dixon gives a shot to Joel Rodriguez up in St. Helena. Now, here's maybe the thing that you have to walk away with and understand just how bad this is. The study found that Latino workers had a 36% increase in deaths during the pandemic. Black workers had a 28% increase compared to a 6% increase for white workers. That's 6 times, right? The Latinos and to white, and blacks 4 or 5 times, right? Once again, as we look at the numbers, the inequality. Some non-white workers saw particularly high jumps in deaths during the pandemic. The study found deaths among Asian healthcare workers rose 40% during the pandemic, while Black retail workers saw an 18% increase. Deaths among Asian healthcare workers, 40%. And you know that when they say Asian healthcare worker, Filipino is a large number, but this is probably due to the fact that they do not break down. We need to see the breakdowns, but they don't generally. They just clump all Asians together, Asian American. They don't give Filipino a separate place, which is one of the things about the news. But this is why when you read the news, you have to see the news from your Filipino American lens and ask yourself, where's the Filipino? You say this with the news, you say this with history, you say, where's the Filipino? I want my Filipino. I want the Sunday brunch Filipino. Well, this is where you develop your curiosity. I would say we've got to look at this. 40% Asian healthcare workers, deaths rising, right? How it rose 40%, not good. And we have a frontline worker, breaking news general assignment reporter, Michael Capatuan, for the report. So I tip my hat to Michael, fellow journalist. Thank you to Michael. One other story before I leave you. This is a big thing in our community. It's not exactly Marcos, anti-Marcos, but how you look, how you view, how you view Duterte, Rodrigo Duterte is important. This is just today. And this is just another example of the kind of things you saw in Filipino newspapers. Historically, they gave us the news, because where would you see Filipino news? In the American papers, the Stockton Record, on the Sacramento Bee, even the Chronicle. Well, the Chronicle got better as the Filipinos were, as they began to recognize Filipinos in society, American society, in the neighborhood, in California, in San Francisco. But this isn't today's New York Times. Filipino drug raid leaves 13 dead. Officials said 12 suspects and a police officer were killed in the shootout, the bloodiest episode in years in President Rodrigo Duterte's war on drugs. The news story. Thousands of people in the Philippines have been killed in President Rodrigo Duterte's war on drugs. This is by Jason Gutierrez. I would bet a Filipino in the Philippines. Let me put on my glasses. Manila, Dateline. January 23rd. Security forces killed 12 people during a raid in southern Philippines on Saturday, officials said. It was the bloodiest episode in years in President Rodrigo Duterte's war on narcotics. A police officer was also killed in the gun battle, which took place in Sultan Kudarat, a small town in the province of Maguindanao. Two other officers were wounded, officials said. Members of the National Police, accompanied by Philippine Marines, had tried to serve a warrant before dawn at a residential compound tied to Pendatun Adsis Talusan, a former village chief who was suspected of involvement in the illegal drug trade, officials said. Pendatun Adsis Talusan. We were supposed to serve the search warrant, but upon arrival in the area, the suspects fired upon the operating troops, Major Ismail Madin of the Philippine National Police said. Okay, they said the suspects fired on the troops. So, of course, the troops had to fight back, right? How much truth is there? We have to accept this for now. Maybe people will look further. The ensuing gun battle lasted for hours, and frightened villagers roused by the gunfire were taken to safety. Officials said Mr. Talusan was among those killed. It was by far the bloodiest drug raid carried out by the Philippine police since 2017, when a town mayor, also in the South, was killed along with his wife and a dozen supporters. Mr. Duterte had accused the mayor of involvement with the drug trade. So you see how this happens, that you could arrest safely, bring them to trial, have evidence, have a court, have a judge decide. But isn't it better just to go in there and have a shootout? That's the question you have to ask. According to the police, nearly 8,000 people have been killed. And some people say that's an underestimate. 8,000 killed since Mr. Duterte began his war on drugs after taking office in 2016. The police say that most of those suspects were killed by officers in self-defense, but rights groups say officers have routinely carried out extrajudicial killings. The key word, extrajudicial. Last month, the International Criminal Court in The Hague said there was a reasonable basis to believe that the Philippine security forces had committed crimes against humanity in the course of the drug war. Crimes against humanity. It said it would decide in the coming months whether to carry out a full investigation, as if there is a debate. But key question or key point, Mr. Duterte has withdrawn the Philippines from the treaty that established the court. But Philippine rights groups welcomed its preliminary report last month as a way to hold his government to account. 2 complaints accusing Duterte of murder have been filed with the court. And so, here's the news story. Additions my own. But basically, you have a Philippine drug raid leaving 13 dead. They call it extrajudicial for a reason, because you could bring them to the court or you could just shoot them cold in a shootout. And then it could be fair because they had guns, the government has guns. Fair fight, right? Something to think about. This is from today's New York Times. I bring it up because this is the example of the Philippine news we get today. In the, I'd say, old days, but the 60s, 70s, 80s, we get news about Marcos. We get news about Cory Aquino. We get news about Arap. Back then in the 20s, when the first, January 22nd, 1921, the first Philippine newspaper in America was found. Filipino American newspaper in Salinas. What kind of news were they sending back? This is the progress of your country. When you send back money back to the Philippines, this is what's happening. There's always been this connection. What's going on over there and what's going on over here? And those papers, the Philippine, Independent in Salinas, the Philippine News in San Francisco, the Mabuhay Republic in San Francisco. Once again, we had in Stockton. The 3 stars, I read you from Don Mabalin's book. They all had news about information going back and forth, Philippines and here. In Marquelo's 1931, the Stockton Filipino American newspaper, he said, let's tell the truth about what's going on here in America. It's not a good thing in America. We're bachelors. We don't have girlfriends. And when we seek out white women, they shoot us like Fermin Tabera. Tell the truth is what Marquelo was saying. And this is why at the museum, one of the things I'd like to do before I go is come up with a Balitang exhibit showing the news, the importance of the news, Filipino American newspapers, the ethnic press, and how it served our community, telling us what was going on here, among the different groups, and telling us what was going on over there in the Philippines. And now we have to sort of piece things together or go to, I still write my column for the Inquirer.net. I tell Filipinos there and Filipino Americans here what to think about things like the inaugural. Go to my column on the Inquirer.net. Here's an example here. Well, that's an example of Inquirer.net, the actual paper site. But we still do it today. Have to pick the New York Times and other examples to see what's going on back there. But do we care about what's going on back there as Filipino Americans? As we have subsequent generations born here, more Americanized, do we even care what's going on back there? Well, I asked the question, but people are retiring back there. They're thinking they're Americans. They say, I got my teacher's pension. I'm going to go back to the Philippines and spend my dollars and pesos and live like a king. Well, or queen. But how safe will you be when a government guns down 13 people dead? I guess just don't deal drugs. That's the issue. And then we have younger people who are the so-called 1.5s who were born in the Philippines, came here young, teenagers or as young adults or as babies. They have an attachment to their country, or maybe they're fully American, or maybe they're bi-coastal, right? Philippine coast, California coast. We're a complex group, Filipino Americans, and hopefully in our little talk about Filipino American history from a newspaper, from a journalistic perspective, we got a little bit of that today. All right, so that's it. I'm not sure. I got a prayer thing. I got a board meeting. If you want to get in touch with me, Emil Amok, EMILAMOK @gmail.com. EMILAMOK @gmail.com. We'll also put the replays up on all the different sites, on our Facebook page, also on our YouTube site. Check me out on AMOK.com. I'll put a replay of this on AMOK.com. My website. Once again, it is good to be here with you. We do this because we can't be open on the weekends. I know you probably love football, but hopefully this hasn't cut into your football today. But, we do this because we could still do history. We could still encounter and talk about history this way. You don't have to drive to Stockton. You just have to be and think Filipino American history. This way. Easy. Click the link, use it, fast forward, scrub the video, going fast forward, or just, like some people say, they just listen to the page, and they just listen to the it's not really a broadcast, but they listen to the audio on their phones, right? They pick it up on their phones and say, oh yeah, I can listen to Emil. And guess Views expressed are my own. I'm Emil Guillermo. Emil, I'm up to you. Thank you again. Thank you for being here. As my good friend, the late and lamented, the, yeah, we miss her. The San Francisco State professor, Stanford trained Don Bohalano Babalan would have said, Mahals and Salamat.